So, formally welcome to the session today. We're looking at covering, Unit 7 as we are continuing on our journey. And in this unit, employment legislation, today we are looking at covering learning outcome 2. Now, this is going to be slightly a step backwards in terms of what we've, looked at in terms of studying this unit, because what we want to do is revisit the topic of recruitment and selection first, and then relate it to the context of why does HR need to follow legislation or employment legislation when they look at the process of recruitment and selection. So if you recall, some of our discussions in Unit 1 and Unit 2, we specifically looked at recruitment and selection. So when we looked at the process of recruitment, when does recruitment happen? When the organization is looking at employing new people, or if there is a vacancy which opens up, or in some cases if the organization is expanding, expanding, or maybe opening a new branch office or expanding into a new location, there is in general a need for the business to get more manpower. Then the process of recruitment and selection actually comes into play. So the department which gets into swing or into action is the human resources department, and the HR manager gets most probably some sort of a vague description which comes in from the line manager, department manager, maybe the CEO, somebody within the organization, and they start working on the job description, and then the process of placing a job advert, and then looking at shortlisting, and then the whole process of actually recruitment and selection starts. So what I've done in the two slides here is I've kind of put together, in a very short summary, because we don't need to study recruitment and selection here, but the context to recruitment and selection is important, and which I'll explain why, because there are costs associated with recruitment, and every time a company looks at recruiting personnel or recruiting or recruiting people in place of people who have left the organization, there is an X amount of cost which the organization is spending. And these costs can be, directly proportional or can be quite high if the legislation has not been followed, or if the contracts have not been drawn correctly. Then it leaves the organization as well as the, let's put it this way, the HR department open in terms of, arbitration, or in terms of, lawsuits which can be brought in if there are things which are not clearly defined in the contract. So the process of recruitment, we understand very clearly, starts off with job description, specification. At some stage, the HR puts an advert. Once they put the advert, they get, lots of CVs in, or, interested candidates will send in their details once the CVs and resume come in, and they've done this, they've kind of got enough. At some stage, the HR then starts to look at the process of interviews, and in some cases, these interviews are also substantiated by, some companies end up taking, say, tests. So in the case of Google, for example, when we look at Facebook, if they're applying, if they put out a job advert saying we want X number of programmers, then what tends to happen is during the recruitment and selection process, after the CVs have been received, at some stage, some of these guys will be asked to do a coding test or a programming test to ensure that they have the current knowledge for which, for the role that they've applied. Now, once that happens, if we get into a bit more detail into the selection process, we look at it starts off in some cases with initial screening. That means if the HR manager has received 100 CVs, he will screen through those CVs to look at keywords and whether the experience and skill set mentioned match the job description which the HR has created, or the requirement, it meets the requirement. At some stage, once this initial screening is done, you do a bit of shortlisting. You then send across application forms off to the candidate. If they have not filled it up initially, then those application forms are added into some sort of a HR database or internal process of the company to get most of them in. And then you start looking at ability or some sort of test sometimes which happen. And then it leads to comprehensive interviews, round 1, round 2, depending on, the level at which the employee is being recruited. And at some stage, the hierarchy and also how important is the role to the organization. So you'll have multiple rounds of interviews. If the interviews go fine, and then the HR looks at the process of, something called background checks. If the background came out okay, then in some cases, some requirements, also look at medical examinations. So if we look at people applying to, positions wherein they need to have, medical fitness records, in some cases, the HR would then, ask the candidates to look at producing a medical record. And after that is done, they are issued a contract and they get some sort of a conditional offer letter. That job offer letter can be conditional because if there are background checks which are in process, which are being done, and at some stage medical examination or visas and other things have to be checked, then those offer letters become conditional. As long as those conditions are met, the permanent job offer then entails to the candidate. Now, why is all this done? And why we want to recap this in this particular unit of employment legislation? This slide answers that question. Now, if we look at the context of UK in which we are currently studying this unit and looking at relating all of our knowledge and discussions to the UK employment legislation, what we see in the UK is that there is something called the National Audit Office, NAO, and this National Audit Office actually puts out job recruitment adverts for 6 different government organizations, and they are responsible in effect for recruiting people and selecting people for appropriate positions. This could be Work and Pensions Department, it could be the NHS, it could be, for example, the military, it could be defense, and in other cases Ministry of Education and some of the key ministries. Now, the point that I'm trying to make in this slide is that this National Audit Office, because it is public money, they are accountable for every recruitment expenditure, which expense or expenditure they are doing in terms of recruiting people, the right set of people into the organization. So they estimate that an average recruitment costs between £1,400 to £2,600 across different sectors in which they recruit. And after the recruitment is being done, the recruitment, once the employee has been recruited or inducted into the organization, there is further £2,000 which is spent in order to train the employee in terms of inducting the employee or staff, accurately into that particular role. So they undergo some sort of training, some induction program, maybe look at getting some additional training to understand the key role and functions, and that also is a cost. So organizations which recruit higher in the private sector, when you look at when they recruit for specialist roles, for example, if they are recruiting for a doctor, then they might be interviewing and recruiting and selecting for a very specialist role, and this specialist role would require maybe further assessments to be done, and in some cases these assessments involve, as I mentioned, some sort of tests or exercises which the candidates have to pass before even which they come in for an interview. Like in the UK, the doctors, if they are applying and if they've done their medicine as a study, as a subject from outside the UK, then they need to be able to clear some 2 tests which are conducted by the Ministry of Health Ministry, which is PLAB 1 and PLAB 2 tests. Now, these tests obviously cost a bit of money for the organization to run, and only those candidates which are successfully clearing the tests, which are called standards, then are allowed to apply to get a job in the UK if they want to work within the NHS. So basically, the process of recruitment and selection has some costs, but there are additional costs which can be levied onto this process if the recruitment is not done correctly or if the contracts are not drawn out correctly. And this then turns out that an organization in general can recruit somebody who's not suited for the role, which can create further discontent in the organization, poor performance, reviews and reputation of the organization can be harmed. And to a certain extent, what happens is that if we relate the time, effort being spent by different people in the process of recruitment and selection, can be directly attributed to some sort of cost to the company in terms of time and money. Is that okay? Now, when we look at that, what we want to do in terms of the intention of understanding the learning outcome 2 is that when we know that recruitment and selection as an activity is an activity which costs the company money, time, money and effort. Now, it is all the more important for the HR managers to understand the law and legislation which needs to be applied correctly so that when contracts are drawn, they are drawn accurately so as to minimize any such costs which can be indirectly coming onto the company when recruitment and selection as a process is taking place. Okay, so when we look at the individual components of what we need to understand when an employment contract is drawn, we are going to look at studying this particular learning outcome slightly backwards. I'll tell you the reason why. So first things what we need to do is we need to understand, in some cases, why do we need to have a contract? As I explained to you yesterday, that sometimes if you have an arrangement with somebody who's working for you at the home, and that arrangement, like your, in this case, for example, your the nanny or the caretaker for your child did not turn up. Now, this was more or less an implied contract between you and the other person, and that was verbal. So if the person hasn't turned up, you're not looking at suing the person or going legal, or looking at pursuing that, because I'd asked you to come, and if you're not able to make it, then it has costed me some time and effort in terms of I'll have to or I'll have to find somebody else, or in this case I'll have to take care of the child myself. So in some cases what you will see is that if you draw up an agreement and that agreement is verbal agreement, then there are no consequences that you can go after if the agreement is not met. But in the case of employment, most employers, tend to, it's not mandatory, but they tend to enter into some sort of a written contract or an agreement which clearly highlights the terms and conditions and also the expectation and the rewards which the company will provide in lieu of the services which the employee actually provides. Now, in the UK, most employers will actually enter into some sort of a written contract at some stage of employment. Now, sometimes employers do not draw up a contract or a written contract because the person working in that position might be temporary, or that role in which the person has been employed might be temporary because of somebody either going on maternity leave or leaving the organization till somebody else takes that role over or something. It could be any such reason. But in majority of the cases, what we do see, employers enter by, when I say enter, employers actually create written contracts when they employ most people within the organization. Now, the reason why they do is that having a written contract or having a written agreement actually clearly defines the terms and conditions for the employment. That this is what is expected, this is what your job description is, this is what your working hours are, this is what you'll get in terms of compensation, rewards or benefits, and this is what is expected from you in terms of discipline, decorum, or when you have roles and responsibilities, you are looking at basically adhering to this code of conduct, and this is all defined in the written contract. Now, sometimes contracts comprise of something called two terms, and these are called explicit and expressed or implied terms. Now, when we look at
expressed and implied terms, then
and then we will go into the detail of what does express and implied terms mean. But these terms typically are, when the contract is drawn, the contract basically explicitly talks about something which is expressed and something which is implied. Now, expressed would mean that this is something which is mandatorily expected. If I look at implied terms, that this means it could be open to interpretation, and in some cases this would vary depending on the situation the person is actually working in, or depending on the contract the person has been given. So when we talk about, say, express contract, the term which is basically looking at express terms in a contract, that basically refers that you need to directly acknowledge that this is a contract being created by within the two parties, which is the employer and the employee. And in this case, the express terms typically mean that there are some direct promises which the employer, and in this case also the employee, is making to each other when they sign and agree on that contract, and this contract or agreement which gets created is legally binding. So express terms, essentially, if I repeat, what do they mean? That they, in terms of a contract, when it is created, some of the terms and conditions which are directly mentioned in the contract and when the contract is signed off by both parties, that means employer and the employee, then these conditions become legally binding. And these conditions become legally binding because both parties have acknowledged that this is my responsibility and this is your responsibility, and after which they've gone ahead and signed the contract. But when we look at, implied terms, what we want to understand when we look at implied terms would be that, in terms of the contract which is created, here some of the things, in the contract are fairly obvious. That means your work, they will allude to the fact that your working hours are, usual work. Sometimes when you see, let me give you an example. When I say implied terms, they basically, do not clearly express the fairly obvious which is in the contract. An example is that when you work, when you apply for a job, in most cases, the job adverts would clearly say that, this job requires you to work night hours or day hours, right? Now, it is implied and it is understood that when you're applying for this job, and if it says this is a day job, then it is implied that your working hours are going to be between, say, 9 to 5 or 8 to 5 or something like that. And this is implied because you've applied for a daytime job. When people sometimes apply for security jobs, the implied terms could be that, okay, because you're applying for a security job and the security jobs normally, people working within the security work during a night shift, it is also implied that you understand that the working hours are going to be, evening to basically night hours or evening hours. So when we look at these terms are a part of the contract. So some of the job role and responsibilities defined in the contract, employment contract, would have express terms, and some of them would have implied terms. Now, in most cases, when we look at the contract, what we do see that the contract is provided and signed off between the two parties in some shape or form. Now, most companies sign when they offer you the contract, they offer the contract on a letter-headed paper, and that letter-headed paper makes it a formal contract because a company letterhead or some sort of a letter-headed paper has been used to sign that contract or provide that contract to the employee. Now, in most cases, you will see that sometimes these contracts the length and the information provided in the contracts can vary. So sometimes you will see that if it's a contract being offered to somebody who's working in the front office, in the administration, in the reception, or in the operations of the business, you will see the contract, might be 2 or 3 pages long, because there are not many expressed or implicit terms which need to be included in the contract. But sometimes you will see that these contracts run into multiple pages, and some of them have different types of clauses. Now, these types of clauses could vary because sometimes when you look at permanent job contracts, you'll have, things like your probation period, your notice period, your perks, your benefits, termination clauses, all those things being included. But if it is being drawn up for, say, a temporary worker who's going to be employed primarily for, a couple of weeks or a couple of months because they're doing they're coming into cover for a particular role, then in those cases, you will see some of the implied terms, in this case would be, not included in the contract because the contract is basically made in a way wherein, it is a temporary contract. So what I'm trying to say in the last point here is primarily the terms and conditions and the detailing of the contract would vary depending on the hierarchy, the title, the roles and responsibilities that you get within the organization. Is that okay?
Yes, please.
So when we look at the example of express term, now I've picked up one contract which is the Employment Rights Act of 1996. It says that all employers are required to issue employees with written particulars, which is basically written contracts in terms of, and that contract actually covers the main terms and conditions of their employment. Now, these particulars have to be issued within 2 months of commencement of the employment. That means if I employ somebody today, which is say 1st of January as an example, I need to issue a written contract which needs to be signed off both by the employer and the legal representative of the employer and the employee who is accepting the contract within the start of the 2 months of start of the employment. So that is to say before 28th February. Now, some employers are required to do this when you have written contracts, because this is what is a part of now the UK employment legislation, and it is covered under the Employment Rights Acts of 1996. Is that okay?
Yes, please.
Now, if I look at, before I get into the contract type, I look at, say, implied terms. Now, sometimes, as I mentioned to you, that some additional terms and conditions in the contract are mentioned to as implied terms. Now, in all UK employment contracts, implied terms kind of mean that the employer has the ability to be able to impose additional duties and obligations to the employee. Now, I'll give you a simple example. Sometimes in the job description, it says that you are being recruited to do, say, if I look at a job description of a receptionist, and if I bring, say, a particular, let's look at bringing a particular job description up for my organization, look at this as an example. So if, say, for example, we look at a job description for a tutor, right? We want, say, a business and management tutor. Now, what I've done is, in this, I've defined the responsibilities of the tutor. But I've said that this is a business and management tutor. But in some cases, I might say the employed term will be because if the tutor has relevant experience, or maybe some sort of, when I say has relevant experience and qualifications, then I might say the tutor is also required to teach strategic management programs, right? So here I've said deliver lessons via webinar route, but occasionally I might ask the tutor to come into the center and also deliver a classroom-based session. So this is essentially an implied term. But the reason why it is implied is because it is not directly written into the job description. But at some stage, if I do, and when I say it is implied, because at some stage, if I ask the lecturer to come in and do a lecture in the class, he expects that he's going to be paid for that lecture, because he's not going to come in and work for, and obviously deliver the lecture free of cost. So sometimes when you look at creating job descriptions, there are some terms and conditions or in contracts which are not explicitly written down or communicated in the contract, but it is understood that you might also be given other responsibilities on a day-to-day basis, depending on the prerogative or depending on the discretion of the principal.
Okay. Can I ask a question? Yes. For instance, if you get a job and it's stated in the letter, the contract letter, that the working hours is between the hours of, let's say, 8 a.m. in the morning, and you have to close by, let's say, 4 or 5 p.m. in the afternoon. Now, if you start the first week and you close, they keep to time. You close at 5. Then subsequently they start moving it from 5 to like 6 p.m., 7 p.m. Where does that fall?
See, in some cases, what happens is that the employer, now this in the contract, if it is mentioned, it is express terms, that is the working hours are between 10 to 5 or 8 to 5. But if it's on a particular day, the employer asks you to stay back and do some work, that is something which can be construed under implied terms. But if it becomes a regular thing, wherein they don't let you go before 5 o'clock or allow you to only leave at 6:30 and not paying you overtime, then this can be challenged under the implied terms, saying that, okay, my working hours under the contract as defined are between 8 to 5 or, whatever, but I've been asked to do, and, one sort is okay, but if I've been asked to do, and stay back and do this on a regular basis, then I want my working hours to be increased, or, I need to be paid for these hours, because in this case, this is bounding into something called implied terms. And here it is directly related to the wages or the time being spent by the staff on that role, and that is why it needs to be paid for. So the employee can actually sit down with the employer and say that this is something which is now becoming an issue, because if one or a couple of times in the month is fine, but if it becomes a regular thing, then my working hours need to be changed.
Okay.
Okay. Now, so implied terms essentially, are covered under something which is, let's put it this way. It says will be under an implied duty, but not to destroy the relationship of trust and confidence between the employer and employee, so that sometimes you are not pressing on with inhumane hours of working for the employee without having to compensate them or pay them for the reasonable period if they have been asked to work those extra hours. Now, when we look at contract, the basic minimum requirements of contract that needs to be included in a written contract in the UK context would be that most employers would get into, they have to get into providing a contract to the employee within the 2 months of starting the work. And this contract for employment, when it is drawn up, needs to include at least these basic things, which is what is their probationary period, if any, if there is a notice period, what are the benefits and perks which the employee will get, which come along with that particular contract of employment at a title, in terms of wages, things like that. Then employers put in something called confidentiality or IPR related rights, which is intellectual property rights, because if the organization has sensitive data and that data, the employee has access to that sensitive data, then the employee needs to be informed that this data needs to be handled carefully. And in some cases, you will see that these contracts bar the employee, as I mentioned yesterday as well, that they cannot work for a competitor within the, in some cases 6 months, some cases 12 months, and in some cases 3 years, depending on how senior or what is the nature of position that you're occupying. And I gave an example, which I'll refer to again, is that if you look at somebody in a company like Apple, and who works within the product development, somebody who's working on the product development of, say, the iPhone range or the iPad range, and if that senior person, depending if it's an engineer within the department, that engineer might leave the company and go to a competitor, but they might debar him from not joining the company or the competitor for about 12 months or say 18 months. But if somebody is senior enough from the management ends up leaving, like a vice president or somebody who's directly responsible and has secretive information about, the next lineup and when the dates of launch and the product development being done, that person might be, in the contract itself under the confidentiality and IPR, rights, the company might define before you even take up this role that you might not be allowed to work if you leave the company for a period of 3 to 5 years, because some of the data that they have access to would be very sensitive, and also because they are quite high enough in the organization. And then the company also needs to clearly define termination clauses and what are the restrictions, if any, the termination clauses actually put. So non-employability with a competitor would be a post-termination restriction, which a company like Apple or any company, small business, large business, can put if they feel that the employee leaving that position can threaten the position of the company in the market because the employee had access to what is called the sensitive information. Okay. Is that okay?
Okay. Now, yes, could you shed more light on notice period? I really do not understand the notice period.
Okay. What happens is that sometimes in the employment, when you look at a contract, the company looks at putting some sort of a period which is called the notice period. Now, this notice period means that if you're not happy with the employment, you're not happy in the role, and you want to leave the organization, that would mean that the person would need to give a certain amount of time frame to the company in form of a written notice. That means I would say I am now looking to resign, or I am resigning from my post. And if you suddenly end up having this resignation from an employee, the organization might suffer because the output from that particular person or that line of job that the person is carrying out might come to an abrupt halt. So in order to ensure that there is continuity in terms of work and the work being delivered, even if employees are not happy in their position and they tender their resignation, sometimes, when I say sometimes, it is prevalent and present in most organizations, and I would say 99% of the employment contracts would have this clause, is that they have some sort of a period which the employer or the employee needs to give to each other if they are not happy with the person's services, or the employee is not happy with the employer's XYZ things, working conditions, pay, salary package, or benefits, things like that, they would need to give to each other before they leave that position. An example of this that I will give you is, if the company is to go bust, that means the company is to go into administration, or if the company is losing out on business and his business is declining, and if it decides to make redundancies, that means it decides to lay off people from the roles, from their jobs, then in that case, the company has to give at least 1 month, 2 months, 3 months notice to the employees to say that the business has not been performing well, and because of this reason, we would like to make certain redundancies in the department, and these will cover you, and because of which they will officially need to give him a notice period, so that the employee can actually either start to look at other options, look for a job elsewhere, or in some cases they have some sort of a warning that the company needs to provide, so that they have the opportunity to seek employment elsewhere. In the case of an employee, if I get a better job opportunity today, which is paying me, say, 1.5 times extra, I discuss with the HR in the company, they say, no, we can give you a rise, but we can give you a 10% rise, but not 1.5 times, and I still decide that I want to leave the company, then in the contract, the company would have defined that if you have to leave the company at your free will, you will need to give 4 or 6 weeks notice, or 3 months notice in some cases. In the case of senior management, it could be 6 months notice, even a year's notice before the employee can end up leaving the organization. But sometimes this is done in order to protect the business, its reputation, and also to provide continuity. And this happens both ways, both on the employee side and also on the employer side. Is that okay?
Yes, please.
Now, one of the last things that we want to look at before we switch to the first learning, assessment criteria of learning outcome 2, is in the contract. Sometimes there is a term called varying terms also used. Now, what are these varying terms? Now, you were referring to this example of changing work hours. Like it mentions 8 to 5, but sometimes you're asked to do 6 o'clock, sometimes you're asked to do 7 o'clock. Now, these terms sometimes are varying from what has been originally defined in the contract given and signed by the organization. So sometimes employers use varying terms as a clause to make changes to the employment contract. Now, where will you see this happening? Once an appraisal happens, say once a year, if, for example, the job description changes, if there's a sudden change in the market conditions, and because of that, the company needs to make changes in the employment structure of the employment contracts of the employees within the organization. This normally happens when the government introduces budget, and when budget introductions happen, sometimes they introduce new laws or legislation which the employers have to comply with. The government normally would give them time to be able to introduce this and incorporate this into the contracts of the employee. So example here that I would give is that this present government that we have, Theresa May's government, they have progressively over the last years increased the minimum threshold on personal tax that exemption that you can get. So people in the UK, when they earn up to 10,000, it was about 9,850. If you earn more money, obviously 9,850 is called the personal income tax allowance, and this tax is this particular amount is actually exempt from your personal tax. Now, what they have committed to doing in this particular Parliament term is the 5-year term till 2021, is that they said we will steadily increase the amount of personal tax exemption for people across the, for all citizens, would be that they will move this from 9,850 to 12,500. Now, when this legislation was introduced, every time the personal tax exemption increases, sometimes some employers will need to change contracts because of the change in the regulation. So this year, the allowance, when they started in 2016, now this year, I think the personal tax allowance exemption is 12,500. And this is what they expect to take to 15,000. That means if you earn 100,000, out of that 12,500 money would be exempt from any sort of tax. Now, these are varying terms which the employers sometimes need to include in the contracts, because these terms and conditions are external to what they have defined, and sometimes they can change, and that is why they are classified as something called varying terms. other example that I would say is sometimes it is possible that employee has consented that I would want to look at, say, doing additional hours. Now, if these additional hours that you're looking at doing are going to be done for a long duration or period. So when I say long duration, let me rephrase that word. When I say you want to get some extra hours to be able to work with the employer, and these extra hours under consent and discussion with both the employer and the employee say, okay, we need somebody who needs to do some extra hours for about 2 months, and you have consented, and what they will do is they will introduce some sort of a varying clause or a term within his contract which will say that, okay, if you do these extra hours during this duration from such and such date, you will be paid extra for such and such hours that have been put in. Now, this is a varying term because this is not something going to be permanent in the clause or in the contract, but this is going to be, a stopgap arrangement wherein both the employer and the employee agree to paying and also putting in extra hours to be able to do, the work which is required to be done under mutual agreement. Now, in some cases, these varying terms, sometimes, as you mentioned, are not agreed on or have not been explicitly agreed on by the employer and the employee. So your contract says 8 to 5, but your employer doesn't leave you or let you go home before 6:30. So that means you're spending 1.5 hours every day extra without getting paid for it. Now, in those cases, the employee who is feeling disadvantaged can actually bring across a case, against the employer, and that can be dealt with by arbitration in the courts, because the records are maintained and the employee signs in, signs out, or you have some sort of a time in, time out system. And because this has been happening and this is not explicitly or written in the contract and you are being exploited towards it, this as a varying term can be challenged and the employee can be compensated for this kind of an anomaly. Is that okay?
Yes.
Now, let's go back to the main topic when we were discussing, the process of recruitment and selection and why this is cost sensitive. Now, when we look at, we know that every company, when they recruit employees, either by advert, e-recruitment or referral, whatever it is, they spend money. There is a lot of money which is also spent on training and development to basically make sure that the employee is able to optimally work to the level to which the jobs, roles, and responsibilities can be fulfilled. Now, when an employment contract is drawn, what we also need to ensure is, from an HR perspective, that they need to include most of the legislation which has been defined for that country, so that there is no scope for any sort of arbitration related to the employment contract. Now, some of the terms and conditions or acts which have to be adhered to when an employment contract is being drawn are, things like discrimination. Now, in the UK, any form of discrimination is, dealt with comprehensively by the government, by the employer, and also by the courts. Now, UK over the years has introduced a comprehensive legislation which covers all forms of discrimination. So discrimination, when we talk about, can be about sexual discrimination. It could be on the basis of caste, creed, your background. It could be on the basis of disability. And in some cases, when I give you an example of the pay gender gap between men and women, even Equal Pay Act was introduced because it was felt that sometimes indirect forms of discrimination happens in the case when we look at pay, pay standards being kept for men and pay standards being kept for women. So women in the same role with having the same responsibility get paid less as compared to men in that role because, this has been a traditional norm. But in the early 1970s, the UK government introduced something called the Equal Pay Act, and which meant that employees, which have comparable roles and responsibilities and work within similar job roles need to be given equal pay, whether they are men or women. So, irrespective of this, the sex, they have to be given equal pay and treated equally by the employer. So, when we look at discrimination in general, the employment contract, from a UK context point of view, has to include these terms in the contract and explicitly refer to that, the contract would comply with, Discrimination Act, and then the Discrimination Act look at sex discrimination, race, disability, and also equal pay. Now, if I just elaborate that slightly, a bit more, some of the other regulations which are important is when we look at in 2000, another regulation was introduced wherein it said that you cannot discriminate between part-time and full-time workers or workers which are on fixed time contracts. So that means if you employ somebody in a particular role which is on a fixed term contract that they need to work for 9 months to be able to work on this project, and once the project is delivered, their contract will be terminated. They, because are working on a fixed term contract, cannot be discriminated against in any shape or form and will be treated as, normal employees which are working on part-time or full-time basis within the organization. And then even in some cases, when employees look at differentiating that, okay, you're a part-time employee or you're a full-time employee, you're working on a contract, but you are, working on a contract for a number of months, then also there should be no discrimination in terms of, setting the pay grade, pay structure, salary, perks, benefit, just because the person is working on a fixed term contract. Now, there were further legislation which was introduced in 2003, which prevented, in some application forms, now it is not mandatory in the UK to describe your sexual orientation, your religion or your belief. So if you're not comfortable mentioning that on the form and you feel that the employer is collecting that data, you can actually abstain from providing that data in the application form, in the job application form. So the legislation was introduced in the late 2006 to prevent discrimination which can happen on the basis of age, your sexual orientation, your religion and beliefs in the society. So when we look at discrimination in general, we find there are 3 or 4 different types. There is sexual discrimination, there is race, there is disability, there is pay, and then sexual orientation was also introduced so that, there is no way that the employers can actually say that we would not employ, these type of people. Like in the 2 years back, there was a mass revolution across many cities, major cities in the world, wherein the LGBT rights were passed off as, acts within most countries. So they were supposed to be treated, as equals because of their sexual orientation. There was a lot of bias against, the lesbians, gays, and, LGBT rights. So this was also incorporated, and, this has been something which now forms a part of, discrimination in general as a clause or as a paragraph when you drop, employment contracts. Is that okay?
Yes, sir.
What I've done in the subsequent slide is basically detailed out these acts and what they prevent and what is the reason why they need to be included, in the employment contract. So what we need to do is, when we talk about discrimination and when we talk about sexual discrimination in general, there are these different types which can be classified like direct, indirect discrimination, victimization, positive discrimination, and then we need to look at remedies. So rather than me go into this directly, what I've suggested is, in one of the slides, is that in order for you to get more, detail into what I've said, you could refer the guide which is here, this particular guide. Now, in this particular guide, if you look at, if I look at discrimination, section F, it describes, everything in detail. So if I go to page 30, I've drawn all the slides from here because we're studying the UK context in particular. So if I look at this, if I look at this, redundancies, if I look at section F. So if you look at this section F on page 35, it talks about why is discrimination important, and what are the different types and why it needs to be included in the contract. And the different forms of discrimination have then been defined in 1 or 2 paragraphs for you to get a good understanding. And what we want to be able to do is study these pages which are directly related to, your task assessment task of 2.1, because it says evaluate the principles of discrimination legislation in relation to recruitment. So when we say in relation to recruitment, you have to talk about, types of discrimination which is here, and then you have to define this in a bit more detail and cover all these types to meet that criteria of task 2.1.
Okay.
And then the second part that we have looked at is primarily understanding, what are the remedies. Now, in terms, if we feel that the person has been discriminated and take it to the court, and then the court upheld the claim of discrimination, then in this case, the employment tribunals, which are set up as specialized courts which try out cases related to employment and are experts in employment legislation, they clearly specify that if you have been discriminated against in any shape or form and you bring a lawsuit against a firm or an organization, then they will basically try that in court. And if you are to win, then in some cases there are 2 or 3 remedies which are possible. So if you win the case, and in the case that you feel that there is a discrimination which has happened, then the company can be asked to pay or can become liable to pay damages which are financial damages. That means they normally can sue the company to get financial compensation, and that financial compensation can be in the region of up to about £25,000. The second remedy that you have is that in some cases, if you feel that you've been unfairly dismissed or you have faced the case of discrimination and which has led to the dismissal of or you losing the job, then in that case you can ask for if you win the case and your arbitration, then you can ask the role to be reinstated within the organization. And last but not the least, in some cases, if they feel that there is a very strong evidence which which is present, and the employee is able to prove that in court, then the award for compensation can not just be financial, but then it can also be aggravated. Basically, it could be charges or the compensation that the employee can get even for aggravated damages. An example that I would give you here would be that in some cases, the minimum or the maximum financial or monetary compensation which the employee can get cannot exceed 25,000. But if it is proven in court beyond doubt that there was discrimination which had happened, which led to unfair dismissal, which led to the employee suffering, say, some sort of trauma or loss of confidence and not being able to work, or depression, then in those cases the compensation can be higher under the Equal Opportunities Commission, which allows the employee to seek more damages from the employer. Is that okay?
Yes, sir.
So when we look at studying discrimination, it can be of different types, and that's what I've defined here, which is indirect discrimination, victimization. So what is positive discrimination, and last but not least, what are the remedies which can be sought after if you feel that you have been at some sort of a disadvantage while working for an employer or working in your employment, executing your roles and responsibilities on a day-to-day basis. Okay?
Okay.
Any questions on this so far?
Okay.
So this helps us cover Learning Outcome 2. And what I would suggest is, when you look at covering this Learning Outcome 2, my suggestion to you would be to primarily look at in Moodle, downloading this UK Employment Guide, which is here. And this is the one that I'm going to be referring to even to continue to, when we go to the Learning Outcome 3. So you'll be able to get most of the data from this learning guide. And my suggestion would be to study pages 31 onwards till, in terms of looking at the contract, fixed term contracts, things like that. And that would be covered, from pages 35 to 39 in particular to cover Learning Outcome 2.1. And when we look at, the other one was when we look at, contract, what we were looking at was that you could study the contractual terms, which is in section C from pages 7 to 10. What are the terms? What are the terms of the contract? Why the contract is needing to be made? What are the express terms, implied terms, and varying terms? Okay.
Yes, please.
Good stuff. So with this, I'm going to, if you have any questions, then I will take them up now. If not, then obviously what we'll do is we'll close this session for today, and then I'll catch up with you same time tomorrow to cover Learning Outcome 3.
Okay. The UK guide that is in the module that I said I should download.
Yeah, you can download this one.
You said I should go through pages 31 to 39, right?
Not 1 to 39, pages 7 to 10, which is talking about employment contract, and pages 30 to 39.
Okay. Okay.
Okay?
Okay. Yes, please.
Okay, good stuff. Any other questions?